Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Uh, and During my flight from Toronto, from Eastern Canada, for RSA, I was watching this movie of Napoleon that got recently released. And in one of the scenes that struck me was young Napoleon was given the charter to recapture Toulon, which is a Mediterranean port city of France that was heavily fortified by the British Royalist forces. The port was fully guarded by the ships. The fort that is overlooking the harbor is fully occupied, and the city was under the British Royalist control. And young Napoleon was tasked with a very small force to take over the city and win back and against this formidable army. What's interesting is his approach, right? He started doing a reconnaissance and studied the terrain, the fortification, the positions of the army, and in doing his discovery, analyzed the weaknesses and strengths of the occupants. And he quickly discovered there was a hill on the southern side that was guarded the least. And it gave him a vantage point to launch his attack, which overlooked the city and the harbor. And he took this strategy to cut off the defenses, that ships that were protecting the harbor. And then in the stealth of night and darkness, he basically scaled the hill. And then with precision and accuracy, took over the fort. And when the fort and the moat fell, the city the next morning, to the surprise of the enemy, was his. It's interesting because against all of the resources, it sort of goes down in history, as we can see over time and time again, this same story kind of repeats. And one of the reasons why I think it repeats is that if you have a lot of resources, it is very difficult to identify where you should place them to correctly defend and navigate. I think this story kind of tails with this session here in the current landscape, where the threat actors also have ML and AI tools, such as the defenders, and what strategies should we use as defenders to defend the valued assets for our enterprises. With that, I'm Shil. I lead the data science and the ML engineering teams at BlackBerry, and I'm here to take you through our approaches to data science in understanding the threat landscape, in devising the tools, taking a lens through the current landscape as a threat actor, and as a defensive, what strategies that we could use. And I'm hoping that you could take away some of our learnings and techniques that we're going to be talking around. So sit back, relax. Hopefully it's going to be an interesting session. So firstly, I'm required to put this. It's for educational purposes as a disclaimer. And this specifically goes into our vantage of thinking. So the agenda, as I mentioned, it's basically taking through a data science's view of this landscape. I'll start with AI-powered threat landscape, and then we'll talk about what we observe from prevalence data, surge in novel cyber attacks. How do they look like? What exactly are they? Predictive approaches to defense. Majority of cybersecurity, I'm sure you've gone to all of the vendors, and people are mostly focused on EDR, XDR strategies of detections and preventions, but taking a preventive approach is sometimes better than a defensive approach, and it'll help us understand where our attacks might be coming from, and if we could use machine learning to shore up, we have a better chance in protecting our high-value assets. Then we'll look at some observations and observed outcomes based on machine learning techniques and application of data sciences, and then we'll go through a few takeaways. So this is my attempt in trying to sort of put a picture on what a threat landscape looks like. What is interesting in here is that something happened around in 2017 onwards that we see sort of a curve in uptake. This is all of the threats that have been published, whether it's CVEs or CWEs from NVD, and trying to plot them over different scale of severity. And if you look at this, a fitting diagram would be a fishbone diagram that sort of takes you through the various types of attacks that we see. There, on the automation side, we see automated attacks such as various types of DDoS attacks, brute force attacks, scanning. Then we see various types of attacks on the data set, discovery, reconnaissance. There are very targeted phishing attacks that we see, which is basically taking the same model how advertisers use to target based on content, and with the cookies where they know your persona to target ads, the same technology are now used to sort of target specific types of campaign emails as advertising to phish credentials or exploits. And we try to think of this as personalized scams, as personalized target advertisements. And it's sort of the same technology is sort of applicable here. And then we see an evolving generation of polymorphic malwares that sort of changes their behavior and attack signatures and patterns as they are living off the land. We see various types of adversarial training of ML models, of poisoning of the data. And this is just to give you like a fairly high-level view of what it looks like, the current threat landscape. Now, you know, the number of CVEs for how many of you here are on the cybersecurity operational side? Okay, very good. And how many of you here are on data science and ML engineering? Okay, so there is a fair representation. So I'm sure, you know, for those of you who are on operational side, you're inundated with CVEs every other day. You know, it's very challenging. So one of the things that we looked at is we looked at EPSS. Is anybody familiar with EPSS, exploit probability scoring? Okay, great. So a recent paper was published in First Conference, and the idea of EPSS is given a CVE, you know, not looking at its specific severity or the CVSS vulnerability, you look at EPSS, which is basically a predictive model that takes a CVE with a lot of environmental data and makes a prediction, the probability of a particular CVE being exploited in the next 30 days. So with that, if you look at the approaches, you could take the EPSS scores from the EPP models, and then you can plot against all of the CVEs. So this is a historic plot which shows CVSS on your x-axis, and then EPSS score, which is the exploit probability score on the y-axis. And if we segment the chart into 4 quadrants, we see on the y-axis we increase exploitability, and on the x-axis we see severity. Now what is interesting is CVEs that are identified as highly severe is almost obvious. Everybody has a goal to rectify them. But what is interesting is on the left-hand side, the exploitability probability for a low CVE could have a high probability of an exploit, which means the Napoleon story is that if we can identify where we should prioritize our resources based on predictive approaches, then with our limited resources, we can narrow down and prioritize which one we should address first. And this is one machine learning technique that allows us to do so. Now you might ask is, okay, why should we trust this? Well, you should trust this because if you take a look at the history, again published in 2022 in that paper in the conference, is that if you look at the predicted probability of these identified and the ones that we have seen a vulnerability in the 30 days is highly correlated. So this is a log axis which tells you that the model's ability to predict based on all of the inferences, threat intelligence data that it gathers when you give it a particular CVE, it has a fairly likelihood of making a prediction. And this model gets updated every day, so more information of threat and intelligence as comes in, it scores every day, and then you get an output daily. So the thing is that this is a fairly generic model, and we'll go through it and see how you can take an EPSS model, which is available publicly, and then apply your environmental constraints to sort of fine-tune the model to specifically make these determination for your environment. So when we talk about prioritization, we have a lot of data, and in the Napoleon analogy that I started with, if we could give it the entire lay of the land, of the threat landscape, can a machine learning model help us identify the weak links? Or can it tell us which ones are more susceptible to be exploited so that we can focus our resources, we can focus our energy on addressing those? So this is an attempt to sort of make a predictive approach towards understanding our environment or your environment, for instance, and how you would take that forward. So if you look at the disparity between CVE years and publication, you see that a lot of these red here identifies that the time when it was published to when it was actually introduced, there is a large gap. And that gap is basically time that gives the threat actors more opportunity to devise a particular exploit. Now, the interesting thing here is that on the offensive side, it is time to identify the exploit, target the profile, and discover. So threat actors could be using the same approaches to understand which ones they should target to exploit, as opposed to trying out in a random fashion. So these tools can be used by our adversaries to do the same type of analysis. And from the defensive side, it gives us an understanding of the exposure and allows us for a threat zero mitigation. In this particular chart, what I'm showing is, I've taken all of the vulnerabilities and the base temporal scores of CVEs and plotted over time. And what we see here is the very first time last year, we see the number of critical sort of at an interjection point where it outnumbers high for the very first time. And the trend line dotted that is showing as an exponential curve as it's growing. So again, on the adversarial side, it basically gives a very rich threat landscape, more targets, and they could use EPSS as well to discover and exploit these vulnerabilities. On the defensive side, we could use and correlate EPS predictive score to identify the inventories and identify which resources are more important to be protected. Now, what we've done here is with this information, with the EPSS exploit probability scoring model, we've taken that, and then we've taken the EPSS scores along with the threat intelligence data that our threat research team provides, and then we've built a model that sort of takes in the EPSS data and then makes a prediction on which of these highest order vulnerability we need to address first. And if you look at it, you could take the CISA meta exploit, the EPSS that I talked about, nuclei, GitHub POCs, all across your intelligence sources, and then it is possible that you can train a machine learning model that can take it and then help you prioritize. See, what you see in this swanky chart is that the number of CVEs is overwhelming. It's not possible to humanly address all of them. But if you use proper data science approaches, and then if you narrow it down, it helps you identify the the functional exploits, and the most prevalent exploit in a temporal way. And those are the ones, if you prioritize first, you're better off trying to protect your highest value assets. And we'll go through some of the ML data science techniques that got us here in subsequent slides. Now, we see generative AI everywhere, and this is our attempt to kind of decompose and understand what type of attacks are really possible. And what we see is, of course, generative AI is fairly good at data analysis and synthesis, right? Find correlation, find security, vulnerability with the parametric learnings that the models produce. But on the offensive side, we also see LLMs being used to look at attack surfaces to find and exploit vulnerabilities. Securing generative AI models are critical from various types of prompt attacks or poisoning attacks. But as security professionals, I think on the operational side, I think what is most important is to understand that our adversaries are using the same tools that we are in identifying and helping them prioritize their attacks. Content generation is critical. We'll see in subsequent slides how these are being exploited by our threat actors. When you're in your email application and you've been discussing about your holidays or things that you've purchased, how you get your targeted ads to you that are relevant. The same technology is now used by threat actors to basically phish. And the language is very natural to what you would consume. And these are basically orchestrated by LLM-generated synthetic content that helps with these novel types of phishing and infiltration attacks. Model deployment integrity is something that if you are into data science and ML and using these techniques are something for you to consider, but mostly for an operational side, it's to understand this content generation problem and then building necessary tools to work against those. We see generative AI as automation and augmentation. It's also being used to keep security professionals busy, whether it's through DDoS attacks or volume of phishing attacks that keep you busy in those kind of activities, such that your other assets that are vulnerable are more exposed and threat actors have more time in exploiting them while you're busy dealing with the noise, if you will. So that is something to keep in mind. So now, how do we solve this, right? On one side, the tools and the ML approaches are on the level playing field. So how do we approach this? First, of course, we have to do a learning of what exactly has been happening in the last 3 years in a statistical sense, not so much about this happened and that happened, but in a statistical sense, we need to look at it. So, our models, of course, have stopped over 3.3 million cyber attacks, which amounts to 26 attacks every minute. And these are preventative protection, which is pre-execution protection. 70% increase from our previous reporting period, so we definitely see a surge. And about 2.9 unique malware per samples per minute, which means that these malwares are polymorphic in nature, they're unique, and were never seen in the past. And that's 2.9. That's a very, very high number. So no amount of block lists or other such things are going to help you. You need a model to do this for you. And this is our reporting from our threat research team, using our models over the course of the last 4 quarters. And we see the number kind of jumped between May 2023 to August 2023. Of course, we do not have direct evidence, but of course, the generalization and consumerization of LLMs and generative AI is probably one of those attributes. And no specific industry from this report is spared. You see, the increase in finance, in government, in healthcare, critical infrastructure, like it's everywhere. So what we've done is we've taken all of this data, which is prevalence data, and then what we wanted to understand is there a shift that's happening from traditional cyber threats to AI-assisted threats? Are the attacks that we've highlighted, does it evade the defenses that most organizations would otherwise have? So that's the question we wanted to answer. And if we look at this, and we look at the prevalence of all of the discoveries that we have based on this data, we see 39% is around defense evasion. And that is a very powerful story here, because privilege escalation, discovery, and all of these other things, execution, these are sort of the net effect. But the primary thing is defense evasion is one of the most important techniques that we're seeing based on all of this data over the last 4 or 6 quarters. So the question is, there is definitely a shift that is happening. I think this chart would tell us that. So observation from prevalence data. So what did we really see? What is the data that is behind this? So malware ML model convicts OpenTouch AI APIs. So what does that mean? So what we did was we've taken all of the samples that we've convicted, and then we wanted to analyze them and see what external touch points that they have had. So what we see here is malwares that we've convicted were accessing ChatGPT APIs or OpenAI's APIs. Now, what they were doing is a second-order problem, but the first-order problem is this is direct evidence. And of course, we see it aligned with the time that some of these technologies came online in 2023. So malwares are also using Hugging Faces. I'm sure the audience is aware of Hugging Faces. It's like a model repository. So samples that we've convicted are also touching Hugging Faces to download ML models. So then the question is, well, what are the malwares doing downloading machine learning models from Hugging Faces? Okay? So that's the second direct evidence that there is a shift that is happening. Now, what we wanted to do from a data science perspective is we wanted to kind of understand, let's decompose this chart a little bit. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to understand is, okay, now let's look at all of the malicious documents, PDFs, Word files, all of these documents that our ML models have convicted. Let's take them out, and then let's analyze what exactly those reasons were. And what we notice here is, for the very first time, document files exhibit malicious behavior without any embedded scripts. Now, that is interesting. Typically, your documents exhibit malicious behaviors because they have embedded VB scripts or XLM macros and other such things, right, that we stop. But then you have to take a moment and think about, okay, how is it possible that a document is malicious without any executable in them, right? The possibilities could be it might have a phishing link in it. Or it could be the content in the document is so luring and so relevant to your line of business that might make you feel that you should open it and act on it. So the content in the document, when we did the analysis, we see that the documents are synthetically generated, taking advantage of generative AI technologies, and thus a new form of attack vector we're seeing that is coming on. So just looking at the document, parsing it, and then applying ML models to make a prediction is no longer sufficient. You have to actually look at the content to see what exactly is the content. Understand, is the content relevant to the source and the origination of that? And is it trying to lure you into doing something that you would otherwise not do? So the problem space, of course, has become more interesting for the defenders or for data scientists and machine learning engineers like ourselves and our teams. And there is another interesting observation here, as you can see, this is the one that is rising here. And if you see the PDF, windows only in this data, and this line is basically the ones that have scripts in them, okay? So we see that, the ones that are without scripts are kind of going down, and previously PDFs were notorious for embedding malwares because you could embed JavaScripts, you could embed a lot of executables in them. And we see that most security softwares are now pretty good using modern techniques to thwart them, to block them, and I'm sure all of you have it the same. But what's interesting is now the content is now important, and that's exactly what this is showing. The number of malicious documents with scripts embedded in them or not. And this is from prevalence data. So when we take these documents, and this is basically where we were going with, and when we probe these documents, we find that they cluster quite nicely being benign and being malicious. This is sort of the traditional ML models that make these assertions. But when we dig into a little bit deeper, then we see that these clusters now separate based on the content. So once we start analyze the content of these prevalent document, we can with certainty say which ones are purely phishing, likely phishing, and likely benign. So this is another evidence that suggests that the content is important. And the reason why I'm taking you through all of this is that there is a shift that is happening. It is important to recognize the shift so that collectively as a community we can identify which ones we should address with priority. So I'll take a moment and take you through what predictive approaches we can do on the defensive side. So these are all of the things that the threat actors are doing. So it's quite obvious that from a defense evasion perspective, you could hide a lot of things, but you cannot hide behavior. And what I mean by that is intent and behavior cannot be hidden because the objective for the threat actor is to either do one of the things in the attack chains, either reconnaissance or discover something or execute a payload or whatever it is. So if we focus our energy on understanding behavior, and if we can model that behavior, then we have a better predictive outcome. So imagine this. If you boil water and the temperature is slowly rising, you know when it's about 60 to 70 that if you produce more heat, it'll boil, right? The question is whether the temperature is changing or not. If you test it once and twice or thrice over a period of time, you will know what the outcome is going to be. It's going to be steam. So taking the same approach, you observe it, you test it, and you see the trend, and then you make a prediction. Now, how do we do that? So what we did was, firstly, we did prioritization based on top 20 techniques. So we've seen all of these malwares from prevalence data, and then we prioritized the 20 MITRE techniques that these malwares exhibited. That would help us discover the tactics that are most prevalent. We associated this with 4 of the 5 techniques, and if we look at this, what we see is these reds are change from quarter over quarter over the last 6 to 8 quarters. And the ones that are in blue are generally steady, because the ones in the blue, as you can see, is DLL side loading, file discovery, application layer exploits. These are standard things that will continue to happen. But if we look at the ones in the red, we see that there is a substantial change in this order. So once we've identified and prioritized these top 20 techniques, we then started to think about, okay, how should we go about building a machine learning model to capture this? Because on one side, some of these malicious behaviors are quite normal from an IT operations perspective. The only difference that makes some behavior not normal or not good behavior are who's executing this behavior. Like, take an example. IT services and operations team often run software updates. They often do disk encryption. They often use SCSM tools to sort of deploy and run various kind of security scans. But what is the difference between that operation versus one that is done by malware? So we were focused on, are there enough signals that we could create a model that will help us discriminate that behavior? And that is very important. Otherwise, you're going to get support calls every day if you deploy such a model with false positives, right? So that's one of the goals. So our approach was, from a process start to process end, we basically, of course, need to have all of the telemetry. So we look at everything that a process has done in order to train a model. So we look at file events that it opens, registry, network events, everything that the process has done over that period of time. And then using that data source, we see that it is possible to kind of cluster same group of behavior together. And then we then further subclassify into specific embeddings. Embedding is a very data science specific term. It just means that you take a highly dimensional data, which has a lot of entropy, in other words, has a lot of information in them. You reduce it down into a lower dimensional data that sort of helps you with the correct discriminator. That's all what it means. So while doing that, it's basically, you can think of it as a translation. So taking a higher order dimensional data, which is the raw telemetry, and then creating a specific embedding of these behaviors, we're able to create specific malicious behavior embedding. Okay, I think that's the only thing to take away here. And then we can train a model, and then we've taken that particular model and we've seen, okay, how confident are we in taking these models output when we run against real data. So there are specific machine learning techniques, but I'm not going to go into those specificities. But what is important here is that the model is very good in terms of the trained model. It's a multiple layers of training with 2 embeddings, which basically means that we've taken the behavior, we've taken the samples, and we've also taken the environment. I think that is the most important thing, because a model trained in a specific environment A is not going to generalize well for an environment B. So what is important is that the model is trained. You can think of it like a base kind of a model, and then you fine-tune it in that environment, and that is the most important thing. So when we sort of do that, we see the model's ability to make predictions when it starts seeing some of these initial behavior is actually quite well. It's quite good. And then we also see that the model's able to generalize it at a fairly high confidence interval, a particular behavior being malicious or not. Now, it does not mean that the SecOps person or the L1 or L3 SOC analyst is taken out of the equation. The entire thing here is this is an example of what is called reinforcement learning with human feedback. So basically, model continuously makes predictions on the environment, and then it learns based on the input of the SOC analyst. And effectively, it's an automatic way of fine-tuning that model for your specific environment. So how do we test such a thing? And what do we observe as outcomes? So as a part of the MITRE test that was done, and the Purple team at BlackBerry, when they were running through these tests, we let the model kind of run in a shadow observation mode to see how well it performs. And I'm going to take you through to this type of an approach to see how well it kind of did. So first, just a very high level, what the specific type of attack was. This is a multi-step process. So one of the things was that there was an email that came in, and there was a Word document that got attached, and there's a macro with a template injection, and effectively trying to establish a C2 channel, as you can see. So when this behavior was initially observed at first by our models, and we can see the models very accurately classified initial access, there is execution, there is defensivation, there is injection, and there is these kind of techniques. And then it makes a prediction that this particular sequence, it's about 98% certain that it's a malicious sequence. Now, what is important here to note is that it's not a single process that it looked at. So we talked about a process start, process end. It also needs to understand how these processes are interrelated. And that's basically where this sort of understanding the behavior for a particular environment makes it important. Then we look at the next step, which is establishing a C2 connection. The models detected that these three techniques were at play here. There is initial access, there is defense evasion, security software bypass that's happening, which is related to the injection of this in SVC host, as we can see. So it picked that up, and it scores them. And we can see that the less the number of techniques that it is able to detect, the less confident it is. The higher the number of techniques it detects, the higher the amount of confidence that the model has. And it's kind of important is because being able to automatically detect MITRE techniques or tactics associated with the behavior, and then able to sequence them in the right order is the most important thing for the ability of the model to make a correct determination. This one is particularly interesting. It has a very low confidence. And the reason for this is if you see this particular behavior, there is nothing malicious in here. There is a 10.90, which is an internal IP. It's some sort of upload that is happening in here. It does identify this as initial access, defense evasion, privilege escalation, but this single technique for this particular process is insufficient for it to make a determination. Even though it thinks it's 79% probable that it is malicious, but there are more other such 79% probable malicious behavior that are typically normal in your environment. So this is one reason why it is very important, no matter what security product or what security techniques that you're using, it's very important to basically understand what is normal in your environment versus what is not. Because finally, that would be the discriminatory factor. Because this could be a very normal behavior as your regular IT tools. And then, this is where, the damage is pretty much done if it progresses. I'm showing you to these stages, like ideally, when the model makes the prediction at the first step with 98% certainty, it should stop and block the process and be done with it. It shouldn't progress to this far. But for the purposes of this observation type of testing, we took it through the entire attack chain, and we see that this one, it of course has more data points. It has more data points to basically make this determination that this process 5 that is now started here, the Win32 executable, that did this bunch of these things are now scored with a fairly high certainty that it is malicious. And it's basically taking you through the same process. But the net outcome of this approach is that if we model behavior, we look at the CVE, we understand the temporal characteristics of certain things, we take the inputs, and then we can classify and understand the behavior, then we're able to stop a particular attack going through very early in the kill chain, regardless of what our adversaries are using or whatever ML techniques that they're using. If we focus on the behaviors and then use the tools that we have to understand which ones to prioritize, then we have a defensive solution that is going to be quite effective. I think with that, I would take a moment and take you through a few takeaways, what you've sort of seen through our lenses on how it is applicable in your kind of environment. So short term, I think, for those of you who are in the SecOps or security operations roles, you could take a look at the exploit probability scoring to see if it's applicable in your environment. You can review and analyze, prioritize exposures for your environment. Take a look at the documents in Atlas Matrix from MITRE. It'll help you kind of understand which ones that you could associate, if you could correlate between those. So in the short term, you should definitely look at exploring. In the near term, you or your teams should enable AI Center of Excellence in Cybersecurity to understand the various types of generative AI applications that you have in your organization and how they're impacting. There are a lot of open source tools. In fact, from BlackBerry, we have the open source project, Introduction to Machine Learning for Security Professionals. There are a lot of tools that are there that you could explore and see if it makes sense. Invest in a protect first methodology. I think we're all, on XDR detection first, but I think protection first methodology and applying preventive techniques would effectively make your defenses better. And in the midterm, I think the evolve part is, I think, if you take a long-term approach towards leveraging community intelligence in threat simulation with generative models, some of the techniques that we talked about, and there are some very interesting community links. There is one thing that I would like to call out is that there is going to be legislation that's coming out. I'm sure that most of you practicing SecOps professionals are aware for protection efficacy and with the CVE and the time that is required to be addressed. And these are some of the techniques that you can use to decide which ones you should prioritize, understanding your entire spectrum of what your exposures are. And I think that's all I had for this. Maybe we can do Q&A to see if there are any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite informative presentation. If you have any questions, please come up to the mic and ask. Thank you.
Hi, fantastic presentation. I think the best so far at RSA, I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. So my question is, you basically created a model that seems very, very aggressive because it has high recall. So how do you prevent the model from being a little too aggressive and blocking things that are otherwise? Because you can basically block everything and then you have 100% recall, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think the model output is, it needs to be calibrated with a threshold, right? Just because the model makes a prediction of 95, 96, 97, 98%, in your environment, when you run the model, let's say in an observation mode, you're going to get statistical amount of scores. And that's the threshold that you should set. So regardless of what the model output is, the threshold is to be calibrated for an environment-specific thing. The other important thing to consider is that, where the challenge comes in is that if you see a lot of benign behaviors and a lot of malicious behaviors, and if there is a score overlap, for instance, then it becomes very difficult to decide where the threshold should belong. And I think for that, effectively, is where the reinforcement learning comes in. If you think about reinforcement learning, one of the primary objective of reinforcement learning is that to take a human feedback and embed it into the loop for the decision-making process. Because if you've seen a certain type of behavior that is benign, and if you tell the model, of course the model has to be aware of reinforcement learning, but if you tell the model that this is benign, then it'll try to suppress those signals further and it'll get better efficacy. So I think the best thing to do is that take the scores, look at the model over time, and see where it overlaps, and then you can decide. Okay, so the question is, can you explain the maliciousness of the Word document? Yeah, so what we observed from prevalence data was that typically in the past, majority of malicious Word documents would either have some sort of macro embedded or some sort of, whether it's an XLM macro or OLE, some script that would make the document malicious. So when the document executes, it does some other things that you don't expect it to do. What we're seeing for the first time is evidence of malicious Word documents that have no scripts in them. And then when we started digging further into it as to what are the attributes that's making the documents malicious, what we've discovered is that the content in the document is malicious. And what I mean by that is the content is luring the user that's reading the document to do something unnatural. So just to give you an example, it's no longer that when you look at the document, you automatically know, okay, that's phishing or that's really bad. But the documents are written in such a way, the context in the document is relevant to maybe something you're doing. Maybe there's a proposal that you've written. Because these documents in the reconnaissance part of these LLMs that I talked about, that models are touching generative AI, it's also profiling you as a person. So the content that is in there is very, very targeted to you. So when you read that, it all makes sense. And if you're not careful, you might do something that you would otherwise not.
I have some questions on, can you clarify on what makes the malware generated by the AI, how you termed it as unique? Can you clarify more on that? Like how does it differ from the traditional malware that, we've been used to seeing, like the structure?
Okay, so the question is, how are the malwares generated by AI different? I think what I was explaining is that the malware that is generated by the AI is not very different in that it has the same elements, except that you can generate it much quicker. By the way, I don't have any statistical evidence that attributes that a particular malware executable or whatever was ML generated. I don't have that evidence. The evidence that we do have is that more recent malwares that we see are using defense evasion techniques much more than what we've seen in the past. We've seen evidence of malwares that have accessed OpenAI or ChatGPT APIs. We've seen malwares that are touching Hugging Faces. In other words, when we look at the malware and we look at its behavior, we see that it's downloading Hugging Faces models. We see it's using ChatGPT. Now, what exactly it is doing is still in research, because this is very new. It's like just a few months that we've started noticing some of these observations. But for the OpenAI APIs that these malwares are using, we believe that is related to keystroke capturing and learning behaviors, or it is just an evasion technique. Because if you look at your network, I'm sure you have NDR and other security tools at play, and you see it's normal, because you're associating that particular process, the event tree, with those destinations which are very trusted. Clearly, you're not blocking them at your firewall. So we feel that it's defense evasion techniques. However, if you look at specific type of malwares that are generated by these LLMs like Black Mamba or Fraud GPT. There's lots of these. You can just look it up in the internet or the dark web. But all of these tools have not demonstrated efficacy in an attack that our tools do not address today. But what has changed is the ability of the adversary to do the reconnaissance at a lightning speed, to understand where to attack, and to generate tools to do so very quickly. I mean, just think about it. If GitHub Copilot lets you increase your development efficiency by 25 to 30%, I think that's what I saw from the Microsoft booth, I'm sure it's increasing the same amount of developer efficiency for these malware developers, right? So I think that's the correlation.
All right, thank you.
Hey. Hi. Yeah, so I'm a data scientist who works on sort of a similar problem. And one question I was kind of curious about is for those models you were showing that kind of take the embeddings as an input and are sort of trained to classify these documents as malware or not, or these processes and things, like how often do you find the need to retrain models or fine-tune models? Because there's sort of domain shift over time, and you alluded to a model trained in one context will have some kind of poorer performance in another context, and so I'm curious, like, how often you find the need to retrain them, or do you see this domain shift, especially over time, as being kind of a problem, or what thoughts you have on that?
That's a great question. So within our data science team, we use a metric called temporal predictive advantage, and we've written some content around it in our blogs. And what that effectively means is that there's a lot of AI, you just have to go to the floor, and everybody's doing AI, but one question that you have to really answer in talking about predictive models is how well is the models generalized, right? As a data science, I mean, that's the fundamental question. Now, how do you prove that? I could sit around, show you all the equations, show you all the stuff that we're doing, but the only proof that we feel is the test of time. And what we have been doing is we have introduced this metric called temporal predictive advantage as a probability metric to evaluate the model's performance other than the standard industry sort of model metrics. And what that means is that we take the model data about 6 to a year out when we are doing the validation, and then we give it completely newer data, not newer samples, but newer data from the current quarters, for example, and we see if there is any observable change in the model's ROC, okay? And that would tell us how generalized the model is. Now, to your specific question, what we see is the models that convict these document files or PDF, Word, PowerPoint, all of that stuff. What we see is the only thing that changes is the scores now tend to be fairly fixed over time. So the models are quite generalized if I look at the documents, because the document behavior doesn't change. The only thing that has changed, we were seeing that our scores were dropping because of a lot of content being generated without any script. So when we evaluate the document, we don't see that. We hit a lot of false positives, and that's when we started looking at the content. So now the thing that we've done is not so much about the score drift, but there are new vectors that are required to basically use in the model, and that's what we've done. So I mean, it's too early to say, are there going to be any drifts on that? But maybe next time if we do this session, maybe that will be the time to say if there were any drifts. But right now, it's hard to say because content-based evaluation is pretty new that we've applied.
Thanks. Yeah, that's insightful. Thank you.
Hi, great talk. I have 2 quick questions. Can you talk a bit about how you determine the temporal window for observations of behaviors? Is it dynamic? How you determine what the optimal window is? Mm-hmm. And then the second question is, even though there's reinforcement learning, there's likely a cold start problem. Can you talk about the order of magnitude or all of the C2 level breaches, human evaluations, or do you have an automated way to collect those?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great question. So first I'll try to address the temporal window question. So what we've actually done is that we've defined what is called a process unit. And a process unit is a process start to a process end. And that process could have done multiple different things, and we capture all of that, right? And that temporal window could be few hours, few days, who knows, because it only stops when the process ends. Because we wanted to define these process units start to stop in the training data, so that we can build a model that can look at the entire process window and then make a prediction. Now, oftentimes, of course, as you said, in the real world, a process would sort of start, and then the end is sort of quite far out. And then our task is to figure out, is it going south, or is it going north, or is it normal, right? That's what we're trying to figure out till it actually sort of ends. Once it ends, of course, we know what it did. So, that really depends on the specific techniques that you've used for the model training. And I think the thing that I can share with you is that if you look at a sequential learning, in other words, if you look at the behavior and if you look at the sequence of that behavior, that will give you a better predictive outcome than looking at the entire process without taking sequence into consideration. And with some of the modern tooling and some of the technologies, I think, LSTM type sequential models were very expensive to train, for instance, with very large amount of data. But with transformer-based techniques, I think, the bidirectional encoder-based sequencing technique will lead you to a better result. So the temporal window does not matter. What matters is the sequence and the orders and how quickly they're happening. So that's number one, so taking the time window out of the equation. Second is, the zero start problem. So yes, it is true, it's a zero start problem. But I think we create models, and our models sort of go into our MDR services, for example, Silence Guard, Silence Endpoint, and all of this thing. And what we do is when we turn some of these things on, we run this in an observation period for a period of time, where we basically take the SOC input, or the security service professionals' input, to sort of fine-tune what is normal, what is not, and sort of calibrate based on that. So cold start remains a problem, I think, that you've identified. The best that we can do is observe it and learn from it in the environment that it's deployed.
Thank you so much. We're past 2 minutes. And please, if you have more questions, take it outside in the hall. We must clear the room now for next session.